Look at the concrete driveway or garage floor beneath your feet right now. If you own a home, there's a good chance you've already walked past a hairline crack today. Maybe it's a tiny split that appeared last winter. Maybe it's a jagged opening wide enough to swallow a pencil. What did you do when you noticed it? Did you do what most homeowners do? Drive to the nearest big box hardware store, grab a gray tube of crack filler, squeeze it into the gap, and hope it survives another winter? Or did you call a contractor, only to hear a quote of $800, $1,500, or even $3,000 to grind, patch, or replace the slab? Put your wallet away for a moment, because what if the long-term answer to that crack costs less than a cheap sandwich? What if one of the simplest ways to protect concrete involves nothing more complicated than an old farm oil that generations of rural builders knew about long before modern repair products filled hardware store shelves? The first time I saw it being used, I didn't believe it either. I was standing inside a huge milking parlor on an Amish farm just outside Berlin, Ohio, talking with a 63-year-old farmer named Eli. His father had poured the concrete floor back in 1962. Then, in 1971, a major diagonal crack nearly 10 feet long opened across the slab. For more than 50 years, Eli had been treating that same crack every 7 to 10 years with a clear liquid kept in an old brown bottle. The material cost each time? Barely $2. That caught my attention, because I had recently paid a commercial contractor $1,100 to inject high-tech epoxy into a basement wall crack, only half that size. And before leaving, the contractor warned me that I might need to call him again within 5 years. When I told Eli that story, he didn't make fun of me. He simply gave me a quiet, almost sympathetic laugh. The kind of laugh you give someone who has spent far too much money without realizing there might have been another way. So why has such a simple, inexpensive method disappeared beneath decades of expensive repair products and corporate marketing? Why have homeowners been trained to think concrete protection requires complicated polymers, specialized cartridges, and heavy equipment, when older methods have been sitting quietly inside barns and workshops for generations? Today, we're opening that forgotten toolbox. Part 1. The relentless enemy inside the stone. To understand why this Amish method matters, you first need to understand what concrete really is. Concrete is one of the most widely used man-made materials on Earth, yet most of us think of it as an almost indestructible block of solid stone. It isn't. Under a microscope, concrete behaves more like a rigid sponge. Throughout the slab are countless tiny capillary pores and air voids left behind as mixing water moves, reacts, and eventually leaves portions of the hardened material. Concrete is incredibly strong when you compress it. A properly built slab can support a multi-ton pickup truck without a problem, but concrete performs poorly in tension. In simple terms, it does not like being stretched, and that weakness becomes critical when the silent enemy arrives: water. When winter temperatures fall, water trapped inside those microscopic pores can freeze. As liquid water turns into ice, its volume increases. Inside an open container, that expansion may seem harmless. Inside a rigid concrete pore with almost nowhere for the expanding ice to move, the effect is completely different. The pressure begins pushing outward against the surrounding material, like countless microscopic hydraulic jacks. Tiny internal weaknesses become larger. Microscopic openings turn into hairline cracks. Hairline cracks can gradually widen into visible fractures. This repeating process is known as the freeze-thaw cycle. Once enough moisture has entered the pore structure, another freeze can create enormous internal stress. The damage is no longer simply about what you see on the surface. It is happening inside the concrete itself. So, how does the modern home improvement industry usually tell you to deal with the problem? You're offered acrylic surface sealers, polyurethane crack fillers, caulking tubes, epoxy kits, and an endless collection of specialized repair products. But think about the patches you've seen around older homes. How many still look perfect years later? Most surface repairs place a different material against the original concrete. Meanwhile, the slab continues expanding and contracting, as temperature and moisture conditions change. The repair material and the surrounding concrete do not always move at exactly the same rate. Eventually, the bond between them can begin to separate. Water finds another pathway underneath. Winter arrives. The trapped moisture freezes again. And by spring, instead of one visible crack, you may see new cracking beside the area you thought had already been repaired. The modern industry calls that maintenance. Old-timers had another name for it: a treadmill. Part 2. The $2 miracle. Flaxseed, oxygen, and the chemistry of impregnation. So what exactly is the legendary $2 Amish mixture? There is nothing exotic about it. There is no proprietary polymer created inside a corporate laboratory, and no complicated two-part cartridge. The traditional formula is remarkably simple: boiled linseed oil, thinned with mineral spirits, mixed in roughly equal proportions. Linseed oil comes from flaxseed. For centuries, craftsmen, farmers, painters, and builders relied on it for protecting wood, preserving tools, finishing furniture, coating wagon beds, and mixing traditional paints. But the important question is this: why would an oil normally associated with wood have any value inside concrete? The answer is the way linseed oil behaves when exposed to air. Unlike a liquid that simply evaporates and disappears, linseed oil cures. As oxygen reaches the oil, chemical reactions gradually link its molecules together. The liquid slowly becomes a tougher, flexible solid. That makes it useful as a protective material. But there is one obvious problem. Pure linseed oil is thick. If you pour a heavy layer directly onto concrete, much of it can remain at the surface instead of traveling deeply through the fine capillary structure. That is where the second ingredient becomes essential: mineral spirits. When boiled linseed oil is thinned with mineral spirits, the mixture becomes much less viscous. It flows more easily and can move farther into the tiny pores of the concrete through capillary absorption. The mineral spirits act as the carrier. They help transport the oil into the concrete instead of leaving it sitting entirely on top. As the mineral spirits evaporate, the linseed oil remains behind throughout those pores. Exposed to oxygen, the oil gradually cures inside the concrete. That is the key difference. You are not simply placing a wax-like coating over the driveway. You are allowing the liquid to penetrate into the porous structure itself, occupying spaces where moisture might otherwise collect, and helping create a barrier against future water intrusion. Instead of fighting freeze-thaw damage only after another crack appears, you are trying to reduce the amount of water that gets inside in the first place. And that raises an obvious question. How can an old agricultural oil pressed from flax compete with expensive modern concrete sealers? Part 3. The Highway Files. When the state trusted a farmer's oil. If this sounds like nothing more than rural folklore, the history becomes much more interesting. Linseed oil-based concrete treatments were not limited to barns, workshops, or Amish farms. They were also used on major public infrastructure. During the middle of the 20th century, highway departments faced a growing problem as winter road salting became more common. Salt water was soaking into concrete bridge decks. Once inside, moisture and chlorides could contribute to freeze-thaw deterioration, reinforcement corrosion, surface scaling, and spalling. Concrete that looked solid from above could slowly begin breaking apart. That created an expensive challenge. Public agencies needed a protective treatment that could be applied across enormous areas of concrete without requiring complicated equipment or extremely costly materials. And one of the solutions they turned to was surprisingly familiar: boiled linseed oil thinned with mineral spirits. Instead of relying entirely on a plastic film sitting on top of the bridge deck, the idea was to let the oil penetrate into the concrete and reduce the movement of damaging moisture and salts into the surface. For years, highway engineers experimented with linseed oil formulations as curing compounds and anti-scaling treatments for concrete structures exposed to harsh winter conditions. Later evaluations compared boiled linseed oil treatments with newer proprietary sealers. And linseed oil continued to attract attention, because it could penetrate beyond the immediate surface, helping reduce chloride intrusion and surface deterioration even as the exposed concrete experienced wear. In other words, this wasn't merely a bottle sitting in an old farmer's workshop. The same basic material had once been trusted on concrete infrastructure carrying thousands of vehicles. An inexpensive agricultural product was competing with far more elaborate commercial formulations. Which leads to another question. If linseed oil had such a long history in concrete preservation, why did ordinary homeowners stop hearing about it? Part 4. Why big concrete buried the flaxseed? The answer may be much simpler than a secret conspiracy. Economics. Concrete repair and restoration is an enormous business. Every cracked driveway, damaged garage floor, flaking patio, deteriorating walkway, and failing slab creates another opportunity to sell repair materials or contractor services. For the homeowner, those repairs can quickly become expensive. For manufacturers and contractors, they create recurring revenue. Imagine selling someone a proprietary acrylic sealer that gradually wears under sunlight, traffic, weather, and repeated seasonal changes. When that product begins failing, what happens? The homeowner buys another container, or hires another crew. Then a few winters pass and the process repeats. That homeowner becomes a recurring customer. Now compare that with someone who walks into a farm or hardware store, buys boiled linseed oil, mixes it with mineral spirits, treats the concrete, and then goes years before needing to think about it again. There simply isn't as much money in that transaction. That doesn't require a dramatic meeting in a smoke-filled boardroom. It only requires ordinary financial incentive. Companies naturally advertise products that generate revenue. Retailers dedicate shelf space to products customers repeatedly purchase. Contractors build businesses around services people repeatedly need. A cheap traditional material that offers years of protection does not create the same commercial cycle. Slowly, the old method disappears from everyday conversation. Brightly packaged synthetic products take over the shelves. The techniques known by previous generations become harder to find, and eventually, homeowners assume those older methods never existed at all. But you don't have to remain on that treadmill. The important part is knowing how the mixture was actually applied. Part 5. The Step-by-Step Homestead Protocol. If you want the linseed oil treatment to perform properly, preparation matters. You cannot simply pour the mixture over a dirty crack and expect the concrete to absorb it correctly. The first step is deep cleaning. Take a screwdriver, stiff wire brush, or similar tool, and remove loose dirt, crumbling concrete, weeds, and any old patch material from inside the crack. Work carefully along the entire opening. Then use a shop vacuum to pull out the remaining dust and debris. The goal is to expose clean, porous concrete. And there is one rule you do not want to ignore. Do not wash the crack with water immediately before applying the oil. Concrete absorbs moisture. If the pores are already filled with water, the oil cannot move into those same spaces effectively. The slab needs to be thoroughly dry. That means allowing several days of dry, sunny weather before applying the mixture. Once the concrete is ready, move on to mixing and application. Combine approximately equal parts boiled linseed oil and mineral spirits inside a clean glass container. Stir until the two liquids are evenly blended. Then apply the mixture directly into the crack using an inexpensive brush or a squeeze bottle. Do not stop at the visible fracture. Brush the mixture across a band of concrete on both sides of the crack as well. The goal is to allow the surrounding porous material to absorb the treatment, so moisture cannot simply bypass the repaired area from the edges. Give the first coat time to soak deeply into the slab. While the surface remains slightly tacky, follow with a second, lighter application over the same area. That second coat helps finish the treatment near the surface. There is also one safety issue that must never be ignored. Boiled linseed oil releases heat while curing. An oily rag that has been crumpled into a tight ball and left inside a garage can trap that heat. Under the wrong conditions, the temperature can continue rising until the rag ignites. This is a genuine fire hazard. When you finish using your rags, spread them completely flat in a single layer outdoors on gravel, or hang them separately where air can circulate around them until they are completely dry and stiff. Once fully cured, they can be discarded safely. Timing also matters. Many DIY applications are done during the hottest part of a sunny afternoon. That is exactly when the concrete has been warming for hours. As the slab heats, it expands slightly, and the crack can become narrower. At the same time, strong heat can cause the mineral spirits to evaporate much faster, leaving less time for the mixture to travel deeply into the concrete. A better window is after the slab has cooled. Late evening, nighttime, or early morning gives the concrete a chance to contract. The crack is more open, and the cooler surface slows evaporation. That gives the mixture a better path downward into the porous structure, instead of letting it cure too quickly near the top. Part 6. The second Amish secret: water glass and castle builders. But what if your concrete has problems beyond cracking? What if the surface is flaking? What if your garage floor releases a fine gray powder every time you sweep? What if moisture seems to keep moving through the slab? That brings us to the second traditional material in this story: sodium silicate, commonly known as water glass. This compound has been used for generations in masonry and mineral treatments, and its behavior inside concrete is completely different from a simple surface coating. To understand why, you first need to look at what happens when cement hardens. When Portland cement is mixed with water, a series of chemical reactions begins. Those reactions create the hardened structure we recognize as concrete. But the chemistry inside a slab does not simply switch off the moment the concrete becomes hard enough to walk on. Unreacted material can remain inside the hardened mass. During cement hydration, one of the most important products created is calcium silicate hydrate, commonly called CSH. This is the hard, interlocking material responsible for much of concrete's strength. Another compound present is calcium hydroxide, sometimes called free lime. Unlike the dense CSH structure, calcium hydroxide contributes much less to strength. It can move toward the surface, appear as deposits, dissolve in moisture, and leave pathways through the porous concrete. That is where sodium silicate enters the picture. When a diluted sodium silicate solution penetrates concrete, active silicate moves into the pores and encounters available calcium compounds. A chemical reaction follows. New calcium silicate hydrate can form inside those spaces. Instead of creating only a film on top, the treatment reacts within the mineral structure. The practical idea is simple. The liquid enters porous concrete, reacts with available material inside, and creates additional hardened mineral deposits within the capillaries. That is why sodium silicate became known as a treatment for dusty, porous concrete surfaces. Rather than coating the slab like paint, it chemically changes material inside the concrete. The result is a denser, harder surface with reduced water absorption and far less dusting. You are not simply hiding the weakness beneath another layer. You are triggering a reaction inside the slab itself. Part 7. The garden lime hack: reviving old weathered slabs. But very old concrete creates another problem. Imagine a driveway or patio poured 40 or 50 years ago and exposed ever since to rain, snow, air, and repeated seasonal weather. Over decades, the concrete undergoes a natural process known as carbonation. Calcium compounds inside the material gradually react, migrate, or become depleted near exposed surfaces. That matters because sodium silicate needs available calcium to create the reaction we are looking for. If an old slab has lost much of that reactive material, applying sodium silicate alone may produce a slower or weaker response. This is where Eli's grandfather used another remarkably simple trick. He reached for ordinary hydrated lime, sometimes sold as garden lime. The idea was to put the missing calcium directly back into the mixture. Before treating an old stubborn crack, he would blend a small amount of hydrated lime into the diluted sodium silicate solution. Now think about what happens. Instead of waiting for the sodium silicate to search through heavily weathered concrete for enough available calcium, you are introducing fresh calcium hydroxide directly into the liquid. As the mixture moves into the old porous concrete, the sodium silicate and the added lime can react together. Crystallization begins more aggressively. The liquid starts creating a dense mineral structure inside the weathered material. What might otherwise develop slowly can now harden much faster. And because that reaction is occurring inside the porous crack, rather than merely forming a cosmetic layer across the top, the treatment becomes part of the mineral structure around the damaged area. It is an elegant way of working around one of the natural problems created by aging concrete. Instead of replacing the entire slab, the missing ingredient is brought back to the reaction. Part 8. Wood ash geopolymerization. Transforming fireplace waste into synthetic stone. But eventually, you may encounter a crack too wide for any liquid treatment. Maybe the opening has widened into a large gap. Maybe pieces of concrete are already crumbling away. Maybe the damaged area needs something closer to a structural mortar. That is where the final method enters the story: wood ash geopolymerization. If you burn hardwood in a fireplace, wood stove, or fire pit, you probably shovel out buckets of gray ash every winter and throw them away. But hardwood ash is more than useless fireplace waste. It contains reactive mineral compounds including calcium, silica, and potassium. Once the larger charcoal pieces and debris are screened out, the remaining fine ash can become part of an entirely different kind of repair material. Mix finely sieved wood ash with clean masonry sand. Then activate that mineral blend with concentrated sodium silicate. At that point, you are no longer making ordinary Portland cement mortar. You are creating a geopolymer, a synthetic mineral binder formed through chemical activation. The highly alkaline sodium silicate begins breaking down reactive silica and alumina phases in the ash. Those dissolved materials then begin linking together through a process known as polycondensation. Silicon, aluminum, and oxygen become part of a three-dimensional mineral network. The loose ash begins transforming into something much closer to synthetic stone. And one of the most interesting components in hardwood ash is potassium. During geopolymerization, potassium ions become integrated into the developing mineral framework. Instead of producing nothing more than an extremely rigid patch, these ions help create a structure capable of tolerating tiny movements inside the hardened material. That matters, because the concrete surrounding the repair never stops moving completely. Winter arrives and temperatures fall. Summer sunlight heats the slab. The concrete repeatedly expands and contracts. A rigid patch that behaves differently from the surrounding material can crack or separate. But a wood ash geopolymer repair is intended to move with those small thermal changes, instead of resisting every movement until the bond fails. The result is a mineral patch designed to lock into the damaged area while tolerating the same seasonal stresses that caused so many conventional repairs to break loose. Think about what we have uncovered. For generations, homeowners have increasingly been taught to look at their property as if every component comes with an expiration date. A sidewalk cracks, a garage floor begins shedding dust, a patio starts flaking, and the automatic response is to call a contractor, replace part of the slab, or buy another expensive proprietary product from the hardware store. Then, a few seasons pass, and the cycle begins again. But the Amish approach comes from a different mindset. Their barns, workshops, walkways, and farm structures were maintained with simple materials and practical knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Not because those materials were mysterious, not because the people using them possessed some magical secret, but because they understood how ordinary materials behaved and kept using techniques that worked for them instead of replacing those techniques every time a newer product appeared. A bottle of boiled linseed oil, mineral spirits, sodium silicate, a small amount of hydrated lime, a handful of screened wood ash. Simple materials, used with a completely different philosophy. Maintain what you own, understand the material, work with it instead of waiting until the damage becomes expensive enough to force replacement. That is the real lesson behind these forgotten methods. Before you leave, I want you to answer one question in the comments. What is the biggest, most frustrating crack you are dealing with right now? Is it in your driveway, garage, patio, walkway, or basement? Tell me how long the crack is, how old the concrete is, and how much money you have already spent trying to repair it. I read those comments because they tell me exactly which forgotten skills and old-school solutions we should investigate next. And if you believe practical, self-reliant knowledge like this deserves to survive, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this video with another homeowner who is tired of paying repeatedly for something that never seems permanently fixed. This is Survival Roots. Stay solid, stay independent, and thank you for watching.